Hey, this is Harry, and I just yesterday went to see Eyes Wide Shut in the theater for the first time. It was a Christmas screening, pretty ironic considering how craved this movie is. But it does happen around Christmas time in New York City. Obviously, this movie came out in 1999. It was directed by Stanley Kubrick, his last film. He also wrote it, a loose adaptation of an Austrian novel from a century ago. And it stars Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman, Sidney Pollack, Alan Cumming, and a couple of other somewhat notable actors kind of come in and out. Todd Field as Nick Nightingale. It had been many years since I saw this movie, and I was very curious to see it on the big screen, just be fully immersed in this kind of quote unquote New York. It was actually filmed in London, and it doesn't feel very New Yorky, I don't think. There's a lot to say about this movie. I'm sure most people watching this have already seen it. Um, it was very powerful last night to watch this. Um, I think the movie is about the disintegration of the nuclear family and living in a city and what that does, even to people who do love their spouse and want to be moral people. The temptation everywhere and the kind of worship of transgression that has accompanied our culture ever since the 60s, I would say, is a lot of what's kind of underneath this movie. It's just thrilling to play classical music and live in this kind of and live in this ancient estate with stone walls and conduct this bacchanalia, this kind of like Roman kind of sex orgy kind of scenario. Just really disturbing how kind of thrilled the characters seem to be to get off on it. Um, I will say, watching the movie, I'd forgotten a lot of the pacing of this movie. The first hour or so is Tom Cruise interacting with his wife, interacting with a couple of women at a party. Um, then he's kind of wandering around New York City at night, and then finally he gets to Somerton, the estate, and goes in and finds the orgy in that whole scenario. I'd forgotten how long the stuff in the estate actually is, just wandering around before the woman tells him to leave, you're not safe here, and all this stuff. Amanda, the woman who he'd seen earlier, a prostitute who had been called Mandy by Sidney Pollack. I'd forgotten that. And then after that, after he leaves and he wants to find out what happened to the woman who sacrificed herself for her, there's a very kind of Christ scenario in this movie, and there is a very kind of Roman crowd, Sanhedrin kind of character to the wealthy people at this party. Um, I'd forgotten how long it takes after that for Tom Cruise to figure out that she's dead and to go visit her at the hospital and see her dead body and then confront Sidney Pollack about it and argue with him over a pool table and talk about this and do that and try to reconnect with people and have a 10-minute long conversation with Alan Cumming at the hotel. And it goes on and on and on. To me, that seemed a little long this time watching it. Maybe I was just tired. You know, it was like 9 p.m. by the time the last act of this movie was getting going in my screening. So it did, maybe I was just, I didn't have my full attention on it. I actually was paying attention, but maybe that was it. But I do wish the movie had sort of the shape of the movie had changed a little bit, and that we found out a little bit more about this person and their marriage. Um, I did think the imaginary sequences with Tom Cruise flashing to his wife, Grace Nicole Kidman, having sex with the sailor after she tells him the story about wanting to do that a year earlier. Those scenes were really effective. And I didn't remember those scenes being so effective. It's just an intercut. It's just kind of Tom Cruise staring straight ahead. And then this kind of black and white, like grainy kind of like stop motion kind of footage of Nicole Kidman and the sailor in a bed. But it's very, very effective. Um, it it represents cinematically how imagined transgression can colonize the mind, and you just start thinking, you almost end up attributing behavior to this woman, even though she's your wife and you love her, and she said she never did that, she just wanted to, and everything. You find her guilty, or you find her guilty of wanting to do that, or you find yourself guilty of being too weak to stop it, or too weak to be attractive enough that she would never want to do that and never fantasize about it. And it just colonizes his mind. And that stuff is very, very effective. A lot of the filmmaking in this movie is obviously very effective. It's technically well made. It just, the classical music almost constantly playing in the background. And then the instrumental version of Strangers in the Night, the Frank Sinatra song, one of my favorite love songs, the do 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 do. Do, 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 do. Was just so spot on. Good New York song as well. Um, on this watching, I was really impressed by Nicole Kidman's acting. You know, everybody talks about her, and I think Tom Cruise is great as well for the most part. But Nicole Kidman is just so committed to a role and like really sly, but also very emotionally open and kind of angry. There's something so profound about the way she plays this role. She's sort of every woman and also a deeply specific person who's locked in a little bit of a toxic relationship, more than a little bit. I just loved her in this time I watched the movie. I just thought she was fantastic. Um, so getting back into what this movie is really about, obviously now there's a lot of talk about mm, how maybe Stanley Kubrick knew about Epstein Island or about Harvey Weinstein, right? Or these kind of very wealthy people, mostly Hollywood people, but some, maybe operating in Westchester or just outside of New York City or whatever. These very wealthy men who start to kind of create these like spaces of bacchanalia, sexual depravity that's kind of controlled and authoritarian. And yeah, I think that is interesting to think about whether Kubrick had heard about some of that stuff. Um, whether he thought like the Playboy Mansion was like that, although that was obviously much more influenced by hippie and it was less choreographed and nobody was wearing masks and everything. I think what's more interesting is the analogy to what's been happening on dating apps now and with polygamy and so on, which is that as the nuclear family holds less sway over most people, what happens is not just everybody running around and having varied, experiences of love and very, fulfillment. It's that a couple of very wealthy men can set up conditions for very materialistic, narcissistic, young, attractive women that they will always flock to them. And then women who are moral, who just want to be mothers or whatever, are really hurt by this because it's tough to work, to be a good mother, and to be perceived as backwards by society because you don't like the sexual revolution. And then men who don't have that much money or are not, high status or whatever, are really hurt by this because many women just look down on them and say, oh no, I could meet somebody on a dating app who's way taller than you or has way more money than you or way more attractive than you, even if that person would never marry them in real life, right? So there's this kind of inflation of your idea of who you can marry, coming from women because they've been on dating apps, because they're watching Instagram videos about, how some millionaire treats his wife and, what he buys for her and where he takes her on vacation. And so there's this inflation, and you end up in this really perverse situation where you have these kind of sex slaves or harems, so people chasing after these individual men. And the mask thing is interesting as well because a lot of what people reveal about themselves on dating apps and then in hookups and then in these parties or in these like events is not very deep. It's not, people don't really get to know each other that deeply. And I think that's the best analogy for this movie. You can make Epstein or Weinstein analogies for sure, but I think as a fable of what has happened when you abandon the nuclear family, how bad it gets in society. Um, That's what's most effective about this movie, and it is disturbing. It is very, very disturbing. All the violence in this movie happens off screen. Like the woman who dies, that happens off screen, which kind of makes it even more disturbing. There's a sense that there's this kind of ceremony and these masks and this great architecture and this classical music and all these ceremonies. And then lurking just beneath it, like if you go into the next room, people could be tortured if they don't live up to what they're supposed to do in this weird ceremony. So there's this real threat of darkness and violence hanging over the proceedings, which is very, very far from what like the orgies of the 60s, like the Woodstock generation, peace, love, and everything. It's like Wall Street people running orgies, it's or doctors, right? And that's another thing about this movie, honestly, that I think is very relevant, which is that like doctors, and I'm grateful for, many doctors are good people who are trying to do the best they can, but I don't think there's any doubt that there are some people who get into becoming a doctor because they're kind of perverted and they want to see the human body and they want to kind of experiment. And it feels like that's a lot of what's going on, especially with the Sidney Pollack character. Really disturbing. Um, Overall, I'd recommend this movie, and I recommend seeing it on the big screen. It's a fascinating experience, very disturbing. It really does colonize your mind, and one of Stanley Kubrick's best, in my opinion. I'm not as big a fan of The Shining or probably, A Clockwork Orange or Full Metal Jacket. A lot of his later movies, I do love Barry Lyndon. I love Doctor Strangelove, but a lot of his more, recent movies up until Eyes Wide Shut I was not the biggest fan of. I thought they were overlong and overly didactic politically and so on. Eyes Wide Shut is one of his most fascinating films and fascinating to watch Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman kind of break up their marriage in real time. So I recommend it. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll be doing more movie reviews as I catch up on a bunch of Oscar movies this season. There are also a bunch of Christmas screenings. I'm going to see It's a Wonderful Life later today. Maybe I'll talk about that. Um, so I'll keep the videos coming. Thanks for watching.